I took the overnight shift at KBRN because I ran out of room to pretend freelance work was still paying my bills. The local venue gigs had dried up, 2 bands I used to mix for had stopped booking regular shows, and the last check I got from a podcast client bounced hard enough to cost me a bank fee. My car insurance was overdue. My power bill was sitting on the kitchen counter with a red notice stamped across it, and I'd already used up the polite version of every excuse I could give. KBRN needed someone for midnight to 6, board ops, basic logging, keep the automation moving, call if anything broke. It wasn't the kind of job anybody bragged about, but it was a paycheck, and that was enough. I got to Burnside Annex a little before midnight and sat in my car for a minute with the engine running, looking at the building and telling myself not to overthink it. East Burnside still had traffic a block over, and there were lights on in a bar across the street, but this part of the block felt cut off from the rest of it. The building looked like it had been 3 different businesses before it became a radio station. Brick front, narrow windows, an old metal awning with paint peeling under the edge, and a side lot with faded parking lines that probably meant something to someone during the day. It didn't look abandoned. It looked used. There was a difference. It looked like a place people still depended on, even if nobody had the budget to make it look good. I parked near the back fence, killed the engine, and grabbed the envelope they'd mailed me earlier that week. Badge, a photocopied contact sheet, and a key ring with 2 keys on it. The front door was dark, and I already knew I wasn't supposed to use it after hours, so I went around the side like the email said. The side entrance was a dented gray door with a card reader bolted into the frame and an old security camera above it. The lens looked cloudy. The card reader worked fine. My badge lit it green on the first try. The lock buzzed, and I stepped into a narrow hallway that smelled like old carpet, hot dust, and coffee that'd been sitting on a burner too long. The hallway walls were painted a color that was trying very hard to look warmer than beige and failing. There were framed station posters hanging crooked, some local band promotions, a fundraiser photo, a summer block party flyer from a few years back. Overhead, fluorescent lights gave everything a flat, tired look. I could hear music somewhere deeper in the building, low and steady, and I followed it past a break room with a dead vending machine and a microwave that looked older than me. A handwritten note was taped to the microwave door in thick black marker. I didn't stop to read it. I kept going until I found the control room. The control room looked exactly like the kind of room I expected from a station that had been patched together over time. It was small, square, and packed with gear. The console took up most of the front wall, with worn fader caps and label strips that'd been written over more than once. 2 monitor speakers were mounted high in the corners, angled down toward the chair. The automation system was running on a desktop that looked newer than the console but older than anything I would have bought for myself. The queue was already loaded with tracks and station IDs, all lined up in neat blocks. There was a log sheet clipped to a board on the desk, half filled out in tight handwriting from the previous shift. Headphones hung off a hook by the rack, one ear cup taped near the hinge. The room worked. You could tell that right away. You could also tell it stayed working because somebody knew every weak point and kept fixing only what they had to. I'd just set my backpack down and started looking over the log sheet when I heard quick steps in the hall and the door opened. Kristen Hale came in like she was already halfway to the next thing on her list. Mid-30s, maybe. Dark jacket over a station t-shirt, hair pulled back, no wasted movement. She looked at me once, looked at the console, then reached into a folder under her arm and pulled out a laminated card. "You're Holden Boone?" she asked. "Yeah, that's me," I said. She set the laminated card on the console beside the faders, tore a strip of clear tape with her teeth, and taped the top edge down. Then she taped the bottom edge too, pressing it flat with the side of her hand like she'd done it 100 times. The card was 5 rules in bold black print, numbered and spaced out so you could read them fast. I caught words before I read the whole thing. Monitor, headphones, unknown files, Studio C, internal line, test tone. It looked less like training and more like a checklist somebody had built after getting burned. "These are the overnight rules. Follow them exactly," she said flatly. She handed me the keyring and the contact card. One key was for the side entrance, the other was for the transmitter log cabinet in the hall. She pointed with 2 fingers as she talked, quick and precise. The transmitter log cabinet was mounted near the break room. The internal line was the desk phone to my right, and the outside number was on the contact card if I needed to call her. Then she nodded toward the hallway and said Studio C was at the far end, and I wasn't to open it during my shift. She said it the same way she might have told me not to touch the emergency power switch. No story, no explanation, just a rule. I looked down and read the card properly. The first rule was about dropping the monitor speakers and switching to headphones if I heard anything off after 1 a.m. The second was about not deleting or playing any file I didn't recognize from the queue and logging the time before touching anything. The third rule was Studio C. Don't open the door even if the light was on. The fourth was about the internal line. Let it ring 5 times, and if the caller said my name before I spoke, hang up. The fifth rule was for 3:30 exactly. Run a test tone for 10 seconds from the utility folder, then read 1 line out loud, and take my hands off the board. It was written in the same plain font as everything else, but it stood out because it sounded like a procedure from a bad dream. "What's Studio C?" I asked. Kristen didn't answer right away. She just looked at me for a second, then looked at the card like the question had already been asked and filed somewhere. She didn't explain the room. She didn't explain the rules. She just told me the station ran smoother when people stopped trying to understand every weird thing about the building and stuck to the shift. Then she gave the control room one last glance, checked the automation screen, and left as fast as she came in. I heard her steps move down the hallway, the side door buzz, and then the sound dropped out behind her. I sat down in the chair and listened to the room settle. On-air music was coming through clean in my headphones when I put them on, some late-night track with soft drums and a voice mixed low. Under that, I could hear the building itself. A low hum in the walls, steady and mechanical, and the small fan noise from the rack to my left. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic. Just the kind of sounds you get in old places with too much wiring and not enough updates. I looked at the rules card again. The tape was already catching a little dust along the edges. The print was clean, direct, and too specific to be random. I'd worked enough audio jobs to know the difference between a rule made by corporate and a rule made by someone who'd seen the same problem happen more than once. This was the second kind. I picked up the pen, pulled the log sheet closer, and started my shift, trying not to think about the part of the hallway I hadn't seen yet. Once Kristen left, the shift got simple in the way jobs sometimes do when there's nothing to do except small things on time. The automation system was already carrying most of the night. My part was making sure it stayed on track and writing down what happened like somebody might need to verify it later. I watched the queue, checked the program meter, filled out the log sheet, and kept one eye on the clock so I wouldn't drift through the breaks and miss something obvious. It wasn't hard work. It was steady work. I'd done enough live audio and enough late-night loadouts to know how to sit still and pay attention without inventing problems. Radio was different from a club board, but not by much at that level. Signal in, signal out, watch your levels, don't panic when a system looks older than you. The first half hour went by clean. A block of songs ran, then a station ID, then a short underwriting spot, then another block. The queue rolled forward exactly the way it should. I got used to the layout on the automation screen, where the runtime sat, where the next break marker showed, where the active file highlighted in green. The program meter moved the way I expected it to, rising with louder tracks, settling during quieter intros, jumping when a bright vocal hit. I wrote the times and titles in the log and copied the transmitter reading from the little display panel under the rack. The numbers didn't mean much to me yet, but they stayed stable, which was all I cared about. By 12:30, I had the rhythm of it. Check the cue, check the meter, mark the log, listen for anything weird, repeat. It should have felt easy. It mostly did. The only thing that kept pulling at me was how quiet the building was. I don't mean quiet like peaceful. I mean quiet like sealed. We were in a city, in a part of town that still had bars open and traffic moving, but almost none of that made it inside. No bass from a car at the light, no random motorcycle, no door slam from another business. The control room felt insulated in a way I hadn't noticed at first, and once I noticed it, I couldn't stop noticing it. The low hum in the walls stood out more every time the music dipped. It wasn't loud, it was just steady, a flat mechanical tone sitting under everything, like the building had its own note and never changed pitch. I told myself it was normal. Old wiring, vent system, rack fans, any combination of that. I'd worked in studios built in garages and warehouses and basements. They all had a sound if you sat in them long enough. The difference here was the consistency. The hum didn't wobble, it didn't cycle. It just stayed there, and after a while it started to feel like it was taking up space in my head. A little before 1 a.m., I stood up, stretched my back, and walked a slow lap inside the control room while the current track played out. I checked the log cabinet key in my pocket, checked the contact card Kristen had given me, then sat back down and looked at the rules card again. The tape corners were still flat. The print looked even more deliberate now that I'd been working for an hour. I read the first rule twice. After 1 a.m., if you hear voice bleed or speech through the monitor speakers without a corresponding source in queue, lower monitor output to 0 and monitor by headphones only. Log the time. It was one of those lines that sounded overly specific until the exact thing happened. It was maybe 5 minutes after 1. I was looking at the queue and counting down to the next break when I heard a voice through the monitor speakers. Not loud, not clear. Just a clipped piece of speech, like I'd walked into a room where somebody was already talking and only caught the last 2 words. It came from the speakers above me, not the headphones, and it was gone so fast I almost convinced myself I imagined it. I froze with my hand over the mouse and looked at the board. Nothing queued, no extra channel lit. The queue was normal. Program was still running the same track, no overlap, no weird file inserted. The program meter was doing exactly what it should have been doing for the song that was on. I looked at the monitor section, then back at the rules card. Rule 1. I reached for the monitor knob and cut the speakers to 0. Okay, headphones only after 1. Fine, I muttered. I put the headphones on, checked the feed, and listened. Clean. Music only. No voice. I stared at the automation screen for a few seconds, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. I wrote the time in the log margin and noted monitor voice bleed just to be safe. The moment passed, but it left a mark. That was the first time the rules stopped feeling like station folklore and started feeling practical. I stayed on headphones after that. It made the room feel smaller. Without the monitor speakers, the sound sat right against my ears and the rest of the room dropped back into the hum and fan noise. I got through another break, logged another set of readings, and told myself the voice bleed was probably a routing hiccup. Old systems did weird things. Kristen and Derek and whoever else worked here had probably seen enough late-night nonsense to build a card around the most common ones. That was the normal explanation, and it was a good one. So I stuck with it. A little later, I stepped out into the hallway to reset my eyes and neck. The fluorescent light out there felt harsher after sitting in the dim control room. I stood in the doorway for a second, then looked down the hall toward the far end. Studio C was easy to spot even without a sign. The door matched the others, but the window looked darker, cleaner somehow, like somebody actually wiped the glass on that one. No red light above it, no movement behind it, just a closed door at the end of a tired hallway. It shouldn't have stood out as much as it did, but it did. Everything around it looked used and neglected. That door looked maintained. I didn't go near it. I just looked, registered where it was, and went back to the control room. The next weird thing happened slowly enough that I almost missed it. I was watching the queue around 120 when I saw 2 tracks switch places. Not a dramatic jump, not a whole block reloading, just one song stepping ahead of another and the times adjusting by a few minutes. I stared at the screen, replaying what my hand had done in the last 10 seconds. I'd clicked the active line to check remain in time. I hadn't dragged anything. I was pretty sure I hadn't dragged anything. I didn't touch that, I said quietly. I put my hand back on the mouse and moved through the queue line by line, checking for damage. Everything else looked intact. The brake markers were still where they should be. The station IDs were still in place. The durations still added up. If the order had changed, it was minor enough that nobody listening would notice. I considered moving the tracks back, then stopped. I wasn't sure what the original order even was anymore, and the last thing I wanted to do was make a bigger mess trying to fix a small one. I left it alone and kept going. That should have been the end of it. Minor glitch, old software, night shift, fine. At 1:32, a new line appeared in the queue. It didn't fade in. It didn't slot into a normal block. It just dropped into the list between a station ID and a track that had already been scheduled, and the title didn't match anything else on the screen. Ardan Reference 3. I leaned in and read it again. Every file in the queue that night had a station style to it. Artist names, track names, underwriting tags, clean labels. This one looked like internal archive labeling. No artist, no duration note I recognized, no category color I could identify. Just a plain line with a generic file icon, and that name, Ardan Reference 3. My first instinct was to delete it before it reached the top. That was straight-up muscle memory from every half-broken audio system I'd touched in my life. Unknown file in a live queue. Get it out before it fires. My cursor was already moving toward it when I saw the rules card in my peripheral vision. Rule 2. Don't play or delete any file you don't recognize from queue. Log time, capture screen, call if repeated. I stopped with the cursor over the file. The card hadn't just warned me this could happen. It had given me the exact order of operations. That made my skin crawl more than the file itself. I pulled out my phone, angled it so the cue and the clock were both visible, and took a screenshot. Then, I wrote the time in the log margin and added a short note under the last entry. "I'm logging this," I muttered. I kept my hands off the mouse after that. I just watched the line in the queue and waited. Part of me expected it to start moving toward the top like a normal file. Part of me expected the system to freeze. Neither happened. Ardan reference 3 sat there for maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30, long enough for me to memorize the shape of the words. Then, the queue flickered once, the line vanished, and everything closed back up like it had never been there. No error message, no warning, no change to the active track. The program meter kept bouncing with the song on air. The headphones feed stayed clean. I sat there with my phone still in my hand and looked from the cue to the rules card and back again. The file was gone. The screenshot was on my phone. The time was in the log. I'd done exactly what the card said because the card had been exactly right. That was the part I couldn't shake. If this had been random software behavior, the rule could have been vague. If the station just had old gear, the rule could have said call engineering. Instead, it gave a sequence. Log it, capture it, don't touch it, like somebody had watched this same thing happen before, more than once, and learned what made it worse. The hum in the walls seemed louder after that, even though I knew it probably wasn't. I stayed in the chair, headphones on, eyes on the cue, and waited for the next break marker to hit, trying to keep my breathing even and my thoughts in the practical lane. Automation glitch, archive file leak, old routing, something technical, something fixable. I had a note in the log and a screenshot on my phone. That was enough for now. I told myself that and kept working, but the room didn't feel simple anymore. I made it another 20 minutes before I picked up the contact card and called Kristen. I didn't want to be the new guy calling the program director in the middle of the night over one weird file, but I had a screenshot, a timestamp, and a rule card that had predicted the exact thing. That felt like enough to justify it. I used my cell because I didn't feel like learning the outside line process while I was already keyed up, and I kept my eyes on the cue while it rang. It went to voicemail on the third ring. Her greeting was short and professional, same tone she used in the room, like she'd recorded it between meetings and never listened back. "Kristen, it's Holden Boone. I've got a file in the queue that doesn't belong here," I said. I kept it simple. I gave the time, told her the file name, told her it disappeared before it played, and that I logged it and took a screenshot. I didn't say the part about the voice bleed through the monitor speakers because I didn't want the message to turn into a ramble. I just gave her the practical version. "Call me back when you can," I said. I hung up and set the phone down beside the log sheet. The room felt tighter after that, not because anything changed, but because I'd crossed the line from managing my shift to reporting a problem. The problem still had no shape. It was just a file, a clipped voice, and a set of rules that knew too much. I looked back at the automation screen and waited for something else to happen. For a while, nothing did. The queue rolled clean through a station ID and 2 tracks. I logged them, checked the program meter, checked the time, and tried to settle back into routine. Then the queue refreshed after a break, and a new file dropped into the list. Voice test Holden. I stared at it long enough that the active song almost hit the next marker before I moved. Same plain file icon. Same weird labeling style. Different name. This one had my name in it. I grabbed my phone and took another screenshot without touching the cue. The line sat there right under an underwriting spot, like it had every right to be there. I looked from the file name to the phone screen and back again, trying to tell myself Holden was a common enough name and this could still be coincidence. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like the system had seen me log the first file and changed the label on the second one. The file stayed in the queue longer than the first one, long enough for me to check the log time twice, long enough for the back of my neck to tighten up under the headphones. Then it vanished the same way. One little flicker, one little redraw, and it was gone. I was still staring at the empty line where it had been when the internal line rang. The desk phone was to my right, beige handset, small screen, old buttons with the numbers worn smooth. The ring was sharp and louder than it had any right to be in that room. I jumped anyway and looked at the display. Internal. I looked at the rules card, then at the phone. Rule 4. Let the internal line ring 5 times. If the caller says your name before you speak, hang up. Don't answer questions. Don't transfer the call. The phone rang again. I counted in my head, 3, 4, 5. I picked up the handset and held it to my ear without saying anything. For a second, all I heard was a soft line hiss, the kind you get on an old internal system with too much cable behind the wall. Then a man spoke. "Control room online," he said. The voice was close and clean, like a studio mic with a decent preamp and no room sound, warm even, controlled, not loud. He sounded like somebody recording a late-night promo read, relaxed and confident and a little too polished for a random call from another room. The line quality was better than it should have been. No crackle, no distance, no hallway noise, nothing to place him anywhere inside the building. I held the handset tighter and looked at the queue. Still normal, program still running, meter still moving. My mouth was dry all of a sudden. "Who is this?" I asked. No answer. I heard a breath, or maybe a tiny shift in the line, and then nothing. I waited 1 second, maybe 2, then put the handset back in the cradle. I didn't slam it. I didn't want to sound rattled to a voice I couldn't place. I just set it down and looked at the phone screen until the display cleared. The room felt different after that. Same hum in the walls, same fan noise, same song running in my headphones, but the whole place had picked up a center. Before, the weirdness sat in the system, the queue, the monitor, bleed, technical. Now, a voice had used the internal line and spoken into my shift like it expected a response. I reached under the desk and felt around for the extension map Kristen mentioned while she was pointing things out earlier. My fingers found a strip of paper taped to the underside of the desk, folded once and stuck back down. I pulled it loose and flattened it on my knee. It was old, printed years ago and updated by hand in blue pen. Control room, front desk, production, engineering. A couple labels crossed out. One line near the bottom read, Studio C Aux. I looked at the phone display log and matched the extension number from the missed entries. It lined up with Studio C Aux. That line shouldn't even be active, I said. Saying it out loud helped for about 1 second. Then the internal line rang again. Same sharp ring, same display. Internal. I put one hand on the rules card and counted the rings again, slower this time, because my pulse had jumped and I didn't trust my timing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I picked up the handset and brought it to my ear, still saying nothing. "Holden," he said. I hung up so fast the handset knocked against the cradle and bounced once before it settled. I didn't think about it. Rule 4 was clear. If the caller says your name before you speak, hang up. The speed of my hand surprised me anyway. My hands were starting to shake now, not a full tremor, just enough that I could see it in my fingers when I looked down at them. "Nope," I muttered. I sat there for a few seconds with both hands flat on the desk, breathing through my nose, listening to the headphones feed and trying to hold on to the parts of this that were still explainable. Internal line route, old patch, somebody in another room, somebody messing with me. The voice quality was weird, but not impossible. The file names were weird, but file naming was weird in every old archive system. My name in the file title and on the phone made it harder, but not impossible. Maybe Kristen texted someone that I was on shift. Maybe the engineer knew. Maybe there was a whole station culture around messing with overnights and nobody bothered to tell me. The problem with that explanation was the rules card. The rules card didn't read like a prank warning. It read like instructions for staying inside a pattern. I pulled one ear cup off so I could hear the room and stood up. Sitting there was making me feel pinned. I stepped into the hallway and looked toward the far end. The red light above Studio C was on. It wasn't bright enough to flood the hall, just a steady red indicator over the door, but it changed the whole length of the corridor. The light hadn't been on the last time I looked. I was sure of that. Now it glowed like it had always been there, and I had just missed it. Rule 3 came back hard in my head. Don't open Studio C. Don't enter. If the red light is on, return to the control room and stay on headphones. I started walking back toward the control room right away. I didn't go down to the door. I didn't need to. The hallway angle gave me a quick line of sight past the window as I moved, and in that 2-second glance, I saw enough to make my stomach tighten. There was a dim light on inside the room, lower and warmer than the hallway fluorescence. A mic stand was set up behind the glass, already positioned with a pop filter in front of it. No person that I could see, no movement, just a booth-like room at the end of the hall that looked ready for someone to step in and start talking. It didn't look abandoned, it looked active. I got back into the control room, shut the door most of the way without latching it, and sat down. My headphones feed was still clean program audio. I looked at the queue. A new file had appeared. Felix Ardan Final. That was the first time the name became a person in my head. Ardan wasn't just a label anymore. It sat there in full, first and last, with final attached to it like a mastered take. I took another screenshot on instinct and watched the line move higher as the active track ran down. I should have called Kristen again. I should have called Derek, even though Kristen hadn't told me to yet. I should have done a lot of things. What I did was sit there and wait because I wanted to know if it would actually fire. The file reached the top of the queue after the next station ID. The automation didn't pause. It didn't error out. It loaded the file like anything else. I saw the progress bar flash, saw the title line go active, and then I heard a man singing in my headphones. Clean tenor, close on the mic, no room tone, no crowd, no backing track for the first second, just a dry vocal line with that old smooth phrasing you hear on records from another era. He sounded controlled and practiced, not modern, not ironic, not trying to sound vintage. He just sounded like he belonged in a different decade. The voice was good enough that my brain tried to admire it before the rest of me caught up and remembered I was alone in a control room listening to a file that had inserted itself into the queue. Half a beat later, another voice came in under him. It was quieter, tucked below the main line, almost a harmony but not clean enough to be a polished one. More like somebody learning the phrasing by following along. The shape of it hit me before the tone did. The breaths. The way the second voice lagged by a fraction on the longer syllables. the little break at the end of the phrase. I knew that pattern because I lived inside it. I told myself it wasn't my voice. I didn't know enough in that moment to say it was. I only knew it sounded close enough to mine that my shoulders locked up and I stopped blinking. I yanked one ear cup off and listened to the room. Nothing from the monitor speakers because I had them cut to 0. Good. Rule 1 had mattered. I put the ear cup back on and listened to the file for another second, then the cue flickered again. The title line changed, the active file dumped out, and regular program audio snapped back in like a splice. I sat there with my phone in one hand and the log pen in the other, then looked down at the screenshots I'd already taken. Ardan reference 3. Voice test Holden. Felix Ardan final. The names weren't random. They were moving in a direction. First a reference, then a test with my name, then a final file with a full person attached to it. It looked less like a broken archive and more like a process. The worst part wasn't the singing. It was the feeling that the room had started answering me specifically. I'd called Kristen. A file with my name showed up. I answered the internal line. A voice used my name on the next call. I looked at Studio C. A file marked final played into my headphones with a second voice that tracked too close to my own timing. I put the pen down because my hand was shaking enough to make the letters ugly, then picked it back up and forced myself to write the time anyway. The log mattered now. The screenshots mattered. The rules card mattered. I didn't fully know why yet, but I knew this wasn't the kind of shift where you trusted your memory by the end of it. The internal line stayed quiet after that. The red light over Studio C stayed on. The hum in the walls sat under everything like a held note. I watched the cue and the program meter and the clock, and for the first time since I walked into Burnside Annex, I had the very clear feeling that something in the building wasn't just malfunctioning. It was waiting for me to do the next thing. I sat with the headphones on for another few minutes and tried to wait it out, but the room had crossed a line for me. I was still doing the job, still watching the cue and the program meter and the break times, but now I was doing it while tracking the hallway in my peripheral vision and checking the desk phone every time the air in the room shifted. The red light over Studio C wasn't visible from the chair unless I leaned and looked through the door, but I knew it was there. I could feel it, the way you feel a porch light through a bedroom window even with the blinds shut. The next break rolled clean. I logged it, copied the transmitter number, and stared at the rules card while the song after it started. Rule 3 was obvious now. Rule 4, too. Rule 5 still looked like a ritual written by an engineer with a bad sense of humor. I kept coming back to the wording in Rule 2, capture screen, call if repeated. It had repeated. Kristen hadn't called back. That left Derek. Before I called him, I wanted one more piece of something real, not another voice, not another file name. Something I could point at and say this is where it's coming from. I got up, left the control room door cracked, and went into the hallway without looking toward Studio C. The engineering rack area was on the same floor, halfway down the hall past the break room, tucked into a shallow alcove with a louvered utility door standing open. I'd noticed it earlier as part of the background, just one more old station thing humming to itself. Up close, it looked like a museum display that still had to stay in service. 2 racks of gear, one newer and one clearly older, both loaded with patch panels, distribution amps, power conditioners, and stuff I recognized only by shape. The old rack had black faceplates worn smooth around the screws and faded tape labels written in different handwriting over the years. The newer rack wasn't actually new, just less old, with cleaner rails and a couple digital units showing green status lights. Cables ran everywhere, bundled overhead in thick loops, dropping down behind the racks, crossing from one side to the other in zip-tied groups that had been opened and retied so many times the zip ties didn't match. Most of the cable jackets had that dull-look old rubber gets, and most of the connectors looked like they'd been seated for years. Then there were a few that stood out right away. Bright metal, cleaner strain reliefs, fresh tape at the connector necks, white and yellow, marker ink still dark instead of fading to brown. It wasn't a full rebuild. It was maintenance by selection. Somebody had left 90% of the mess exactly as it was and touched only a few paths. I crouched down and read labels on the patch rows. The tape was old enough that some letters had ghosted, but the important ones were still readable. Program out, monitor return, internal line feed. Then, lower on the panel, grouped close together like they'd been arranged for convenience, I found the ones tied to the stuff that had been hitting my shift. Studio C return, archive return, talkback. I looked at the connectors plugged into those points and felt my shoulders tighten again. They were the clean ones. Same newer cable ends, same fresh type wraps, same marker style. The rest of the panel looked like a station surviving on history. Those three looked like somebody had serviced them this month. I didn't touch anything. Derek's name wasn't in my head yet, not fully, but the rules card was. Rule 2 had already saved me from making a dumb move with the queue. I wasn't about to start pulling patch cables in a live station because I was rattled. I just leaned in close and looked. The labels on the tape around the cable sheaths matched the panel names exactly. Studio C return, archive return, talkback. Someone wanted those routes clear and identifiable. There was a narrow shelf next to the racks with a stack of binders and a coffee mug full of dead pens. I flipped the top binder open and found maintenance logs, dates, timestamps, short notes, initials, all written in engineering shorthand that was half-readable if you'd done enough audio work. Most of the entries were boring. Fan replaced, UPS battery test, patch cleaned, then a name started repeating. Derek Voss. I found it on one page, then the next, then 3 pages after that. His entries had a tighter handwriting than the others, all block letters, no wasted words. Monitor test, return path check, sync check, overnight patch verify, internal line route test, Studio C return balance, archive return trim. The dates went back months, maybe longer. Not every day, but often enough that a pattern showed up even if I didn't understand every abbreviation. The pattern was the overnight shift. Most of his notes were logged late evening or after midnight. The timing was written in 24-hour format, which I had to slow down and convert in my head, but it kept landing in the same window. He wasn't just maintaining the station. He was maintaining certain routes during the hours I was sitting in the control room alone. I stood there in the alcove, binder open, hum in the walls louder than before, and felt the whole thing shift from weird to organized. Files in the queue, internal line from Studio C aw, new connectors on archive and return paths, maintenance notes built around the overnight window. It still could have been a technical problem. It still could have been old routing doing old routing things. But if it was, somebody had been curating the exact parts of the system causing the problem. I pulled the contact card from my pocket and called Derek. He answered fast. Not first ring fast, but no sleepy delay either. He sounded like he'd been awake and near his phone. "This is Derek," he said. I turned so I could see both the rack and the control room door down the hall. I wanted line of sight on something familiar while I talked. I'm getting weird files in the queue, and Studio C is calling the room, I said. I gave him the shortest version. Unknown file names, internal line labeled from Studio C aux, red light on over the door, voice on the line. I didn't mention the layered voice sounding like me, not yet. I wanted to hear what he would explain before I gave him everything. There was a short pause, not long, just enough for him to sort his answer. It's probably a return line glitch, he said flatly. He said it too clean, not like he was thinking through a problem, like he'd handed out that sentence before. He started talking in technical terms right away. Archive routing, old monitor return bleed, internal line crossfeed on aging patch paths. Most of what he said was plausible. I knew enough to follow the shape of it. I also knew enough to hear when somebody was using jargon to smooth the surface instead of explain it. I looked at the binder in my hand, at his name repeated across the page. A glitch called me by name, I told him. Another pause. Longer this time. I could hear him breathing through his nose, steady, controlled, the kind of silence people use when they're deciding what version of the truth to give you. Old systems do strange things at night, he said. That line landed wrong too. It sounded like something Kristen would say if she was trying not to answer a direct question. It didn't sound like an engineer responding to a root problem. I leaned my shoulder against the wall and looked down at another page in the binder. Overnight patch verify. Studio C return balance, his handwriting again. I decided to push one name and see what happened. Who's Felix Ardan? I asked. The silence after that told me more than the answer. He didn't make me repeat it. He didn't ask where I saw the name. He didn't say he had no idea what I was talking about. He waited one beat too long, then came back in with the calm voice again. An old local singer, archive material, nothing you need to touch, he said flatly. There it was. Felix Ardan was real enough that Derek had a ready label for him. Old local singer, archive material. The answer covered the name and tried to close the conversation in the same sentence. Nothing you need to touch, control, not help. I looked down at the patch panel and kept my hands in my pockets. My headache had started as a pressure behind my eyes, mild but steady, and the hum in the walls felt stronger in the alcove than it did in the control room. It wasn't louder exactly. It was more focused, like certain parts of the building carried it better. Derek's voice stayed calm while he gave me instructions. He said not to touch the patch panel. He said not to open Studio C. He said he would come in and check the return paths himself. He said it in the order of somebody trying to lock a scene in place before he arrived. Don't patch anything. Don't open Studio C. I'll come in, he told me. I told him okay because there was no point arguing over the phone and because I wanted him talking, but he ended the call right after that. No follow-up. No question about whether the station was still on air. No question about whether I'd logged the incident or whether the queue was stable. Just the warning, then the click. I stood in the rack alcove with the deadline in my ear and looked at the maintenance binder again. Derek Voss, over and over, attached to exactly the roots tied to the weirdest parts of my shift. If he was right, then he was the guy who could fix it. If he was lying, then he was the guy who built it. Either way, he wasn't just some engineer I had to wake up. He'd been in the middle of this path for a while. I put the binder back where I found it and went to the break room sink for water because my head was starting to feel hot and tight. The water came out cold enough, with that mineral taste old buildings have. I drank from my hand, then splashed my face and stood there a second too long with both palms on the edge of the sink. The hum was audible in the break room too, lower under the fluorescent buzz, and now that I'd noticed it in the rack alcove, I couldn't stop tracking it. It seemed to swell and settle in slow waves as the minute hand moved toward 3, never fully gone, always there. Back in the control room, I shut the door almost closed and sat down hard in the chair. The headphones went back on. Program audio was still running clean. The cue looked normal for the moment. I logged the phone call with Derek and the time, then checked the clock and felt my stomach drop a little. Almost 3 a.m. I looked at the rules card and let my eyes move down to Rule 5. 3:30 exactly. Utility folder. 10-second test tone. Say the line. Hands off the board. It had looked stupid when I first read it. Now it looked like the only part of the card I hadn't tested yet. The headache behind my eyes sharpened when I leaned toward the screen. I sat back and rubbed the bridge of my nose and tried to sort what I actually knew from what I was filling in. I knew the internal line mapped to Studio C OG. I knew files were appearing in the queue with names tied to me and Felix Ardan. I knew those exact routes had fresh maintenance on them. I knew Derek had answered fast and sounded fully awake. I knew his explanation made sense in the abstract and felt wrong in the room. The hum in the walls pressed on all of it, steady and patient. I watched the program meter climb and fall with the music and waited for 3:30. And for the first time all night, I stopped thinking of this as a broken system I was babysitting until morning. Broken systems do random things. This felt maintained. This felt practiced. This felt like something in the building was following a process, and I had just hit the part where I was supposed to stop asking questions and sit still until Derek got there. I spent the next half hour pretending the shift was still normal. I kept the monitor speakers at 0, kept the headphones on, and kept my eyes moving between the queue, the program meter, and the clock. I filled in the log on time. I copied the transmitter reading at the top of the hour. I checked the internal line screen every few minutes, even when it was dark. It never rang. That made the room worse. If the phone had kept going, I could have treated it like a problem. Wait 5 rings. Follow the rule. Hang up. Do the next thing. Silence gave me too much room to think. It left me with the hum in the walls, the mild headache pressing behind my eyes, and the memory of my own name coming through a line that shouldn't have been active. My hands had started doing that fine shake again. Not enough to drop anything, just enough to make the pen feel lighter than it should. I checked the clock at 3:22, then 3:24, then 3:26. I looked at the rules card every time like the wording might change. Rule 5 sat there in plain black print, no emphasis, no explanation. At 3:30 exactly, open the utility folder, run test tone for 10 seconds, state phrase, hands off board. The phrase was printed in quotes, logging live signal only. The way it was written bothered me. It sounded less like a station procedure and more like something somebody came up with after arguing with the machine. At 3:29, I opened the utility folder in the automation system and found the test tone file. It was right where the rule said it would be. A short 1 kilohertz tone, 10 seconds, no intro, no tail. I hovered over it and looked at the program meter one more time. Current song was fading toward the next marker. The queue was stable, no unknown file names, no flicker, just the hum in the walls and my own breathing inside the headphones. When the clock rolled to 3:30, I loaded the test tone and hit play. The tone came into my headphones immediately, sharp and clean, dead center, exactly what it should sound like. A plain technical tone, no room around it, no distortion. I looked up at the program meter. It didn't move, not a twitch. The meter sat where it had dropped after the last song, flat and still, while the tone screamed in my headphones like it was going straight into my skull. I checked the active file line. The automation showed test tone running. I checked the timer. It was counting down. I checked the meter again. Nothing. That was the moment the last part of Derek's explanation fell apart. A return line glitch could explain bleed. A queue issue could explain rogue file labels. A patched internal route could explain a weird call path. But if I was hearing a tone clearly and the program meter showed no signal at all, then there was a second path in the room. A false one. Something feeding me audio that wasn't the live program chain. I took both hands off the console so fast I almost knocked the pen off the desk. Rule 5. Say the phrase. Hands off the board. I heard the tone in the headphones, steady and bright, and spoke into the room because there was no talkback button involved, no mic routing I wanted to trust. Logging live signal only, I said. I watched the meter, still dead. The tone was still there, exact and clean. Logging live signal only, I repeated. The tone cut off. Not faded, not clicked out like a bad file. It just stopped. The automation line still showed the file, but the sound was gone. A second later, the 10 seconds ended, and the software returned to the queue. The next track loaded and the program meter came back to life on the first kick drum hit like nothing had happened. I sat there with my hands in my lap because the card had told me to take them off the board. And now I understood why. Whoever wrote that rule wanted a clean line in the log and a clean sequence of what happened. Tone in headphones, no program meter movement, phrase stated. Tone stops, no accidental fader move, no panic click, no extra variable. It wasn't just a survival rule, it was a way to prove the room was lying. The next file appeared less than a minute later. Felix Ardan final. Same plain icon, same cue position trick dropping into a live block like it belonged there. My throat tightened as soon as I saw the name. I didn't touch the mouse. I reached for my phone and took the screenshot first, making sure the clock and the cue title were both visible. Then I listened. Felix came in on the first line again. Same clean tenor, same close mic warmth, same old phrasing that made it sound like a transfer from a different era. This time there was no delay in my body catching up to what I was hearing. I knew what was coming, and still felt my chest tighten when the second voice slid in under him. It was clearer than before. Not as loud as Felix, but closer than the last pass, less smeared, less uncertain. Same breath spacing, same timing, same little break on the long syllable. The voice under him was me in every way that mattered except memory. I'd never sung that line. I'd never learned those words. But the shape of the voice was mine. I sat perfectly still in the chair and listened to maybe 4 seconds of it before the cue flickered and the file dropped out again. Program audio snapped back in. Some guitar-heavy track I'd heard earlier in the night. The meter moved normally. The room hum stayed right where it had been. Nothing on the desk changed, and I had the distinct feeling the building had just shown me a result and was waiting to see what I did with it. The internal line rang. The sound hit hard enough that I flinched. I looked at the display. Internal, same as before. I counted the rings with my eyes on the rules card this time because my head felt hot, and my hands were shaking bad enough that I didn't trust my timing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I picked up the handset and said nothing. "Holden, open Studio C," she said. It was Kristen's voice, not close to Kristen, not similar. It was Kristen. Same clipped pace, same low flat tone on the end of the sentence, same way she put pressure on my name without raising her voice. If I'd heard it through a wall, I would have thought she was in the hall. Rule 4, hit before the shock finished landing. She said my name before I spoke. I hung up immediately and stared at the handset, my pulse banging in my neck. I could still hear her line in my head, word for word, and what scared me most was how easy it would have been to obey it. If the card hadn't made the name trigger automatic, I might have walked to the door before I thought about it. My cell phone lit up on the desk 2 seconds later, vibrating hard against the wood. Kristen Hale. I grabbed it and answered on the first ring. She was breathing fast and she was talking before I got the phone fully to my ear. No voicemail tone, no clipped office voice, no cool posture through the line. This was the fastest I'd heard her speak all night, and it made her sound younger and more scared than she had in person. "Listen to me. Don't let Derek touch Rack B," Kristen said. I stood up without meaning to. The headphones cord snagged on the arm of the chair and pulled one ear cup half off my head. I let it hang there while I listened. She told me not to open Studio C under any circumstances. She told me if Derek got there first and got to Rack B, the room would get worse fast. She told me I needed to keep logging times and not touch anything I couldn't identify. It sounded like she was trying to dump a year's worth of caution into one phone call. I looked at the rules card, then at the log, then at the clock. Every one of those rules had done exactly what it was supposed to do. Not superstition. Procedure. "You knew this could happen?" I asked. There was no point softening it. My voice came out tighter than I wanted, and I didn't care. The room had been using my name in my own voice, and now the program director was calling me like she'd expected this call for months. Her answer came fast, but not defensive. "I knew enough to write the card," she said flatly. That hit me harder than if she had denied it. The card wasn't just a list of strange building habits. It was a map of the ways people got pulled into this. Rule 1 kept me off the monitor speakers. Rule 2 made me preserve evidence instead of deleting it. Rule 4 stopped me from answering a voice that knew my name. Rule 5 gave me a clean way to verify a false signal path. She hadn't just been trying to keep overnights calm. She'd been trying to keep them alive long enough to leave a timeline. I looked at the queue and saw another normal track line rolling up like the station was just doing what stations do. The contrast made me angry in a very clear way. "That's not the same thing as warning me," I told her. She let that sit for half a second, then kept going. She said she'd suspected Derek for a long time, but never had enough to prove what he was doing. Files would show up wrong. Overnights would quit after 1 or 2 shifts. Logs would have gaps right where she needed them. And every time engineering checked the system, the obvious routes looked clean. She said the card was the only thing she could put in front of a new operator without accusing Derek outright and losing the room before she had evidence. Then, she finally gave me the part I needed. She said the path I cared about wasn't the whole rack, just the return path on Rack B. Archive return fed into monitor and internal routing on a hidden split. If I could isolate archive return from those routes, the loop would break and the voice would stop riding the room. She said Derek kept the Rack B subpanel locked and carried the key. And if he got there before I understood what I was looking at, he'd patch around anything I did and I'd be back in the dark. I left the control room while she was still talking and moved fast to the engineering alcove, phone pressed to my ear, eyes jumping across the racks until I found the lower gray panel box she meant. Rack B subpanel, small metal door, narrow key cylinder, Locked. I pulled on it anyway. No give. She told me to look for a spare keyring near the racks, taped under the shelf or in the supply area if Derek had moved it. She sounded like she'd searched for it herself before. I checked under the shelf with one hand and felt only tape residue and dust. I opened the top drawer in the little utility cart beside the rack and found dead batteries, labels, and a screwdriver, nothing else. The hum in the alcove seemed louder now, thick in my ears under her voice. I told her the panel was locked. She said that was expected, and I could hear movement on her end like she was grabbing her keys or already heading for the car. She told me she was on her way. She told me again not to let Derek touch Rack B first. She told me to stay out of Studio C no matter what voice I heard through the internal line. Then the side entrance buzzed. The sound carried down the hallway clear as a bell. I stopped moving. Kristen stopped talking for a second because she heard it too through my end of the call. Footsteps started after the buzz, steady and unhurried, not sneaking, not rushing. Someone walking in like he belonged there. I turned toward the control room. From where I stood, I could see the edge of the taped rules card through the cracked door, the desk phone, and the corner of the console. I looked down at the rack shelf and saw a small unlabeled keyring sitting behind the maintenance binder where it hadn't been a few minutes earlier, or where I'd missed it because my head was splitting and my hands were shaking. I grabbed it without checking which keys were on it. The footsteps came closer, calm and even on the hallway floor. I backed into the control room, set the keyring on the desk next to the rules card, and looked at the door. "He's here," I said. Derek Voss came into the control room carrying a black tool case like he was walking into a routine service call, not a station that had been using my own voice against me for half the night. Mid-40s maybe, sleeves rolled, work boots, no jacket. He didn't even glance at me first. His eyes went straight to the automation screen, then the program meter, then the desk phone. He scanned the room in a tight pattern, quick and practiced, like he was checking status lights on a machine he already knew by heart. Then he looked at me. "You answered the line, didn't you?" he asked. That was the first thing out of his mouth. Not if I was okay. Not what happened. Not whether the station had dropped off air. He wanted to know what I'd said into the room, what it had taken from me. That snapped something into focus so hard it almost steadied my hands. I stayed in the chair, headphones around my neck, one hand resting near the rules card. The spare keyring I'd grabbed was still on the desk beside it. "I answered enough to know this isn't a glitch," I said. He set the tool case down by the side rack and gave me this patient, tired look like I was a kid panicking over normal station noise. Then he started talking in clean engineer language, all smooth edges and no specifics. Return line bleed, archive crossfeed, internal extension drift, old routing behaving badly after midnight. He said it like he'd said some version of it before. He also told me he needed access to Rack B right away. Not, "Let me check the room." Not, "Show me what you heard." Rack B, he said we'd documented after he stabilized the path, and he wanted me to sign an incident log before my memory got contaminated by stress, which was such a weird phrase I almost laughed. He wasn't trying to fix a station problem. He was trying to control the timeline. I looked at his face and pushed the question he'd had dodged on the phone. "Who is Felix Ardan?" I asked. That got a pause. Just one beat, but it was the first real one since he walked in. He looked at the queue, then at the desk phone, then back at me. "It is a system," he said flatly. He said it like he was correcting me. Like the important thing wasn't the name, it was that I stop thinking in terms of accidents and start understanding there was a design here. Then he dropped the act and started explaining. And the more he explained, the more obvious it was he wasn't scared of getting caught. He was proud. He said Felix Ardan was old local archive material, a singer from station recordings and local sessions years back. Most voices didn't survive transfer well enough to be useful. Too much room tone, too much tape hiss, too much inconsistent phrasing. But Felix's voice, he said, had the right qualities: clean center, stable consonants, repeatable breath timing. Held together was the phrase he kept circling. The first voice that held together, he said. He started moving while he talked, not toward me, but toward the side rack in the patch path area, one hand on the tool case handle. I stayed in the chair and let him keep going because every sentence was giving me a map. He explained it in plain terms, maybe because he thought I'd appreciate it, maybe because he wanted me to know how good he was. He'd built a hidden return path off archive return and split it into the monitor chain and the internal line route. That let him feed voice material into the room without putting it on air. The cue insertions weren't the source. They were prompts, markers, labels dropped into automation to make me notice, react, and speak. The actual capture came from what I gave him: a line into the internal phone, a short response in the room, anything clean enough to sample. He called it fragment stitching. He'd take little pieces, line them to the seed voice timing, then feed them back in layers so the operator heard something close enough to themselves to stop trusting what was real. The more you responded, the better the model got. Not software model exactly, but the way he described it, it might as well have been. Just old-school audio and obsession instead of code. I stared at him and felt my jaw lock. "You're recording people," I said. He didn't flinch. "I'm preserving them," he said flatly. That was the ugliest part, not the setup, not the hidden patch. The way he said preserving like it made him the good guy. He started talking about overnight board ops like they were ideal sources. Alone, tired, predictable routine. No one else around to interrupt the progression. He said he didn't need much: a few phone responses, a phrase read clearly, a short reaction to the wrong sound. Once he had enough, he could build a loop that sounded personal. Once it sounded personal, people kept feeding it. Then he admitted the hum. He said the low hum in the building wasn't just old hardware. Some of it was, sure, but he'd tuned part of it. Transformer resonance, line conditioning, and a low-level signal sitting under the room path where people wouldn't consciously clock it, but would still feel it. It made people lose track of time by a little. Miscount rings. Question whether they heard a word or imagined it. He said it with that same practical tone, like he was describing room treatment. He even used the word sealed, and when he said it, I got cold because that was exactly what the building had felt like since midnight. Not haunted, sealed, focused, managed. He said tired people break rules faster when they're slightly off balance. He'd tested it enough to know where the line was. The whole time he was talking, he kept steering us toward movement. He wanted me away from the console, away from the log, away from the rules card. He wanted Rack B first, then Studio C. He finally stopped pretending and just opened the hall door wider so I could see down the corridor. The red light over Studio C was still on. He started down the hall like I'd follow automatically. And I did follow, but only far enough to keep him in view. He opened Studio C and stepped aside like he was showing me a normal production booth. From the hallway, the room looked exactly like what it was once I saw it clearly. A capture room. Condenser mic on a stand with a pop filter already set at mouth height. headphones on a hook, small preamp with gain marks in grease pencil, recorder on a rolling cart with channels labeled, script stand with printed pages clipped in place, drawer labels, old take sheets stacked in a tray. It wasn't a room someone occasionally used. It was a room someone used the same way over and over. He put his hand on the frame and nodded toward the mic like he was offering me proof. "I'm not stepping into that room," I said. That got the first real reaction. His jaw tightened. He kept talking, telling me to check the mic, check the recorder, prove to myself it was harmless. But the pitch had changed. It wasn't reassurance anymore. It was pressure. He needed me inside that room, and I knew it. I backed up and returned to the control room. He followed, and that told me everything. If Studio C was really just a room, he'd have let me stay where I was and patched the rack. Instead, he stayed on me because I was still the thing he cared about. Back at the console, I put the headphones fully on and checked the monitor speakers, still at 0. Good. I looked at the rules card, then at the utility folder on the automation screen. Derek saw me looking and moved a step toward the board. "Don't touch anything till I clear rack B," he said. I ignored him and loaded the test tone file. By then I wasn't trying to prove the room was wrong anymore. I was trying to prove to myself which path was real while he was standing in it. I hit play. The 1 kilohertz tone came straight into my headphones, sharp and centered. I looked up at the program meter. Flat. No movement at all. Same result as before. I was hearing a signal the live program path wasn't seeing. False monitor path still active. Hidden return still connected. I cut the tone and looked at him. He'd gone still in that very specific way people do when they realize you understand the trick. "I know exactly which line you hid," I told him. That was when he lost the last of the engineer calm. He moved for the rack alcove fast, not for me, not for the phone. Rack B, exactly where Kristen said he'd go. I grabbed the spare keyring off the desk and beat him there by a step. My hands were shaking hard enough that the keys clicked against each other while I tried them in the sub-panel lock. First key, no turn. Second key, wrong cut. Third key, caught and turned. I yanked the panel open and saw the inside layout Kristen had described. Small switch bank, short patch row, labels in Derek's handwriting, Studio C return, archive return, monitor feed internal line, and low in the corner, almost hidden behind a cable bundle, a short jumper patch creating the split from archive return into the monitor/internal route with a tiny isolate switch beside it. Derek hit the alcove and reached over my shoulder for the panel. I slammed the sub-panel door edge into his forearm and he cursed, then shoved me sideways. He was stronger than me, and he knew the panel better, but he had to get around my body and the open metal door to reach the exact patch pair. I had one move and one shot. I flipped the isolate switch down and ripped the short jumper out by the connector. The change was immediate. The pressure in my ears dropped first. The hum didn't vanish, but it thinned out like someone pulled a blanket off the room. In the control room, the internal line display cleared. In my headphones, the false path died and the actual station feed stayed clean. The automation cue flickered once, hard, then stabilized. Derek made this raw, furious sound I hadn't heard from him all night. No polished voice, no measured pacing, just anger. He shoved me off the panel and turned toward Studio C, probably to patch around from inside the room or grab a direct route from the recorder cart. I followed because now I knew he needed the room as much as the rack. He hit the Studio C doorway and bent toward the cart, one hand reaching for the recorder and the other bracing on the frame. That was my opening. Studio C had a heavy acoustic door and a privacy latch setup built into the frame, meant to keep people from barging in during recording. He was half inside, half out, focused on gear. I hit the door with both hands and drove it hard. The edge slammed into his shoulder and spun him inward. He stumbled into the room and grabbed at the mic stand to catch himself. I shoved the door all the way closed before he could turn, then dropped the exterior privacy hold into place. Metal clicked, solid. He hit the door from inside once, then harder. No fumes, no vents, no trick. Just the same isolation room he'd used on other people, now working exactly the way it was designed to work. I didn't stand there listening. I ran back to the control room because I needed one thing before cops showed up. His voice, clean, on record, saying enough to bury him. The board had an air check capture path, and once the false return was cut, I trusted the meters again. I routed the Studio C return into a fresh record on the station machine, checked the meter, and hit record. The meter moved when he shouted. Real signal. Real path. Logged time. I labeled the file with the clock stamp and kept my hands off anything else. Derek started pounding and yelling from inside Studio C. Through the actual room path, I could hear him clear enough now. He wasn't begging. He was raging. He shouted that I'd wrecked his chain. He shouted about years of tuning and samples and operators who never understood what they heard. He said overnight names. He said counts. He said enough for me to know Kristen hadn't been guessing. He also said the one thing I needed most, almost by accident, yelling that the archive split and internal root were his build, and no one else even knew where they sat. I kept the recording running. Then, the automation cue flickered one more time. A file dropped into the list. Holden Boone Final. I stared at it and didn't touch a thing. The program meter stayed normal. My headphones stayed on clean program. No false vocal, no layered line. The file sat there for a few seconds, tried to load, failed, and vanished. That was the moment I knew the loop was really cut. It could still push labels into the queue, but it couldn't reach my ears anymore. I grabbed my cell and dialed 911. 911, I need police at KBRN on Burnside Annex. I have a man locked in Studio C, and I have recording equipment you need to see. My voice came out tight. The dispatcher started asking questions, and I answered in short, factual pieces. I told her there'd been an assault attempt. I told her there was an illegal recording setup on site. I told her I had active evidence and a live recording of the suspect making statements. She asked if anyone was hurt. I said I didn't think so, but he'd tried to force me toward the recording room. She asked if he had weapons. I said I hadn't seen any, just tools and rack access. She told me units were on the way, and to stay where I was if it was safe. I stayed in the chair with the headphones on and the monitor speakers at 0, exactly like the rules card wanted. I watched the program meter rise and fall with the actual station feed while Derek pounded on Studio C and shouted himself deeper into my evidence file. The rules card sat taped beside my hand, edges lifting a little now. For the first time all night, the room felt like a room again. Old console, old walls, old fans, live audio on air, and me, finally, in control of what was getting through. I stayed on the line with dispatch until I saw the first lights hit the front windows. Red and blue washed across the lobby glass, then white strobes from the fire truck behind them. I told the dispatcher units were on scene, ended the call, and kept the recording running for another few seconds just to catch Derek still pounding and shouting from inside Studio C. Then I saved the file, wrote the time down on the log, and took one last screenshot of the cue, the meter, and the clock. I didn't leave the control room right away. I muted nothing because the speakers were already at 0. I didn't touch the rack because I'd already pulled the right path. I just grabbed the rules card off the console, peeled the tape loose carefully so I didn't tear it, and folded it once. That card had been the only honest thing in the building all night. I went to the front and unlocked the door. The first officer in moved fast, hand near her belt, eyes scanning past me into the hallway like she expected someone else to be standing there. Portland police uniform, dark hair pulled tight, calm face, no wasted motion. A second officer came in behind her, then fire, then a hazmat tech carrying a case. "Officer Paige Turner, you the caller?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. I pointed them straight down the hall and told them Studio C was at the end. Derek Voss was locked inside, and the engineering rack was in the alcove by the break room. I told them there would be recording equipment in the room and modified routing in Rack B. I told them I had an active recording file from the control room and a shift log with timestamps. I heard Derek hit the Studio C door again while I was talking, louder now that responders were in the hallway, and the sound changed him. He didn't sound like the smooth engineer from the control room anymore. He sounded ragged, furious, and desperate to get control back before anyone saw the room set up the way it really was. Officer Turner moved with another cop toward Studio C while the fire crew staged just behind them. Captain Marla Dunn took over the hallway without raising her voice. She split her people clean, one to the room, one to the rack area, one to ventilation and power assessment. Laura Benton from Hazmat went straight to the engineering alcove first, not the room, which told me she knew exactly what to look for in a building tampering case. She started checking airflow, line noise sources, and power conditioning gear before she even put eyes on the mic room. Detective Isaac Moreno arrived a few minutes later, plain clothes under a jacket, badge out, carrying a small notebook, and that look detectives have when they've already started building the timeline before anyone's finished talking. He didn't interrupt the scene. He watched. He let Captain Dunn's crew clear Studio C and let Laura Benton call out what was safe to touch and what wasn't. Then he started asking me for sequence, not feelings. Time of first wrong file, time of first internal call, time I called Kristen, time Derek arrived, time I opened Rack B, time I called 911. That part, weirdly, was where the rules card mattered most. I handed over my log sheet, the card, and my phone with screenshots lined up in order. The times matched. File names matched. Rule 5 matched exactly with what I'd written about the test tone and dead program meter. Officer Turner read the card once, then read it again slower, and looked toward the control room like the room itself had just testified. They got Derek out of Studio C without a fight, but only because there were enough people in the hall and he knew he was done. He came out red-faced and sweaty, still trying to talk in technical language at first, saying unauthorized access, signal chain contamination, negligent handling of engineering equipment. Then he saw Moreno holding the take notes from Studio C and the little recorder bagged on the cart, and whatever control he had left dropped. He started shouting about his system, about people ruining work they didn't understand, about preserving voices that would have been lost anyway. Nobody argued with him. They just kept moving him. Moreno and Turner spent the next hour in the control room, the rack alcove, and Studio C, cross-checking what I'd said against what they found. They recovered the recorder, storage cards, script pages, take notes, patch notes, and a maintenance binder with Derek's entries all over the overnight routes. Laura Benton documented altered wiring and the conditioned hum path Derek had built into the line chain. Captain Dunn had the room power isolated and the area declared safe before sunrise. By then, the whole station felt different, not because it was clean, but because it had other people in it. Boots in the hall, radios crackling, clipboards, questions, real-world noise. Kristen got there while the sky outside was turning from black to dark blue. She pulled into the lot, saw the police units, the fire truck, the hazmat van, and she knew before she came inside. I could see it on her face when she stepped through the front door. She looked straight at me first, then at the folded rules card in Moreno's hand, then down the hall toward Studio C. She and Moreno talked before she came over to me. I stayed by the front desk because I didn't want to be back in the control room while they photographed it. When she finally crossed the lobby, she looked like she'd aged 10 years since midnight. Not dramatic, just tired in a way that was finally visible. She told me she'd suspected Derek for a long time. Overnight operators quitting after 1 or 2 shifts, strange gaps in logs, archive issues that only showed up at night and somehow vanished by business hours. She said the rules card was the only thing she could put in front of a new person without accusing her own engineer outright and getting shut out of the systems before she had proof. The card, the screenshots, the clean times in the log, Rule 5, all of it gave Moreno a timeline he could verify without guessing. I listened, and I understood what she was saying, and I was still mad. You should have told me the truth, I told Kristen. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize in some big way either. She just nodded like she'd been hearing that sentence in her head for months and finally got it out loud from the right person. KBRN shut down overnight operations that morning. Studio C got sealed before noon with evidence tape and a temporary lock plate. By the end of the week, the whole building was under a full engineering and safety audit. The room Derek called a production space got labeled what it really was in every conversation after that: the Voice Archive Room. They took the gear offline first, then removed the room setup completely later. Mic, recorder, patch notes, all of it. Rack B got rebuilt by outside contractors with a documented signal path and no private sub-panel access. Derek was held pending investigation. I gave a full statement 2 days later, then another one after they pulled more material off the storage cards. There were names in those notes, dates, fragments, enough to show a pattern going back a long time. I didn't work another overnight shift after that. Kristen offered me afternoons for a while, and I took them long enough to stabilize my bills and get my insurance caught up, but I never stayed in that building alone again. I still count rings before I answer a phone, even when I know who's calling. I still mute speakers and use headphones first if something sounds off. And if I'm in a room with a low electrical hum, an old vent, a transformer buzz in the wall, I notice it immediately. I can't not notice it now. A few months later, I was at a convenience store on the east side grabbing coffee before work, and the clerk had a local station on low behind the counter. I wasn't really listening until the station ID came through. Clean male voice, polished, centered, the kind of red I'd heard 1,000 times. For half a beat just under it, there was a second harmony line that tracked the phrase "a little too close." Same breath spacing, same timing, too short to prove anything. Long enough. I reached over the counter and turned the radio off.